Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on the medical equipment market in Latin America. My name is Javier Delgado. I'm the Digital Marketing Director for Global Health Intelligence, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, I want to give you sort of an idea of what to expect. We're going to go over the agenda shortly. One of the other things that's an important component is people ask about if the materials of the webinar are going to be available after, and that's something we want to straighten out, that we always send that out to folks within a couple of days after the webinar. Usually includes the video and the PowerPoint presentation in that sense. So you'll be able to get that. Now, the way that we usually structure our webinars is we do the presentation first, and then we take questions towards the end of the webinar, but you can pose questions at any point in time in the webinar. The way to do that is if you look at your panel, you'll be able to see a number of different icons. One that says Q&A. When you click on that, it should bring up a window. You can type in your question there, and then basically we'll get it and we'll address all the questions towards the end of the webinar. Thanks. Let's go to the next slide here. Basically, this here just gives you a little bit of background on who we are as a company. Our role is market intelligence for Latin American hospitals. So specifically, we track equipment in that sense, basically capital equipment for the most part, and some medical devices. And we also work on market share, and we also track procedures, surgical procedures done in Latin America. So this basically sort of gives the timeline of the company itself over the past few years, starting with its inception in 2014. And over time, we've also released a number of different thought leadership pieces. You can see the covers of some of those up above, like the Megatrends report. And also we produce HospaRank, which is an annual ranking of the best equipped hospitals in Latin America. And of course, we also produce the medical equipment market report. We're actually using some of the findings from that particular report to power the presentation for today. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that report and what it offers. Let's move on to the next slide here. This is a quick introduction of who our speakers are. Our lead speaker is going to be Guillaume Courpart, who is the CEO and founder of Global Health Intelligence, and also the lead author of the report. Christophe Leroy is also here with us, and he's going to talk a little bit about the findings of the report and some of the data that can be helpful, especially for you in terms of planning season now, as that gets underway for 2023 for a number of different companies, especially in the medical equipment and medical devices space. And of course, what you're seeing there in terms of the cover is the actual report itself that powers the findings that we're sharing here today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. All right, so the agenda for today is we're going to start off with technology adoption and sort of the overview of the Latin American hospital market from our perspective and the data that we've gathered recently and over the course of time to give you the sort of that little bit of historical perspective. And then we're going to offer a 2023 market outlook. And then finally, we're going to handle questions. Below, you can see a legal notice. We ask you to read that at your leisure. That's something that we're not going to get into today, so we can save more time for the actual presentation itself. But it basically talks about the information that's being shared today and our liability and things like that. So we encourage you to read that when you have a moment. All right, moving on here. We're about to get started. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Guillaume Courpart to start leading off the presentation. Guillaume.
Great. Thank you, Bel. And thank you, Chris, for being here with us. It's always a pleasure to have you. The lead author on the medical equipment market report for 2022. And you've been doing this for a while, so it's always awesome to get your insights. And I also want to thank everyone else who's joining us from wherever you may be. It's great to be able to engage with you. And as Abel said, please put in your questions in the Q&A element, because this is a live webinar and we'll be trying to answer them throughout as we go over the next hour. Now, I'm very enthused about being here and about sharing some of the insights of the medical equipment market report for 2020. This is a critical year for everyone in the healthcare space, as we've gone through 2 years of pandemic and are stepping out of that. We're now looking forward to 2023 and looking at some of those projections as we're exiting COVID and seeing what happened and what's coming up next. So this is a critical year. It's very, very fun and enthusiastic about what's going to happen. And with this, it's really important to understand where Latin America is in terms of the hospital infrastructure and what's our footsteps. So Abel, if we could go to the next slide, please. When we look at hospital infrastructure on a global scale, we see that there's about 100,000 hospitals worldwide. And we see only about a quarter of those are in developed economies, namely the United States, Europe, Canada, Japan, Australia, and others. That leaves 3/4 of the world's hospitals for emerging markets. And within that, 1/4 of the world's hospitals are in China in and of itself. And nearly a quarter are in Latin America. And that's why Latin America is such an important region and such an interesting region, because it's home to nearly a quarter of the world's hospitals. And if we make a list of the top 10 emerging markets by number of hospitals, we see that 4 of them are in Latin America, namely Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. But that doesn't exclude some of the other countries, which might be smaller, but also have really interesting characteristics. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Bill. If we look at the hospital infrastructure on a regional basis, we see that Latin America is actually quite robust. As I mentioned, we're talking about over 20,000 hospitals, over 50,000 operating rooms, and over 1 million hospital beds. However, we see there's also a major difference between hospitals in Latin America and hospitals in developed economies like the United States or Europe. Namely, the biggest difference is the size of the average hospital. We see that hospitals in the United States and Europe typically have over 160 beds, whereas the hospitals in Latin America typically have 44 beds on average. Now, as you can see from the graph, Chile is an exception within the region, right, with over 100 beds. But all other countries are well below 75. So size has a huge impact when we're looking at medical equipment, and especially when we're talking about high-cost, high-tech medical equipment. And this is particularly true for the smaller hospitals that simply don't have the same leveraging capabilities as the larger institutions. And when we're talking about leveraging, we can be talking about the leveraging of the infrastructure, leveraging of the current equipment, of the number of beds, or the financial leveraging and access to, capital markets. So major differences there. And the smaller the hospital, the more challenging it is to acquire that equipment. And this can affect really high cost, high tech equipment, like it could be robotic surgery systems, linear accelerators, tomography scanners, and MRIs. But it can also affect, on a smaller scale, the smaller hospitals, their ability to purchase X-ray machines and ultrasounds and even better beds or, install better equipment within their operating rooms. Now, when we're talking about telehealth, and I'm sure there's going to be a couple of questions about telehealth in a minute, it's a whole other ballpark, because here what we see is that some telehealth systems are actually quite accessible, while others can be extremely costly, right? So we just have to keep that in mind, that when we're talking about systems and solutions, we can go on both ends of the scale with that. Now, Abel, if we could go to the next slide, please. When we look at health systems on a global basis, we see that there's really 3 pillars that enable health systems to thrive within their countries. The first of which is the number of institutions. And here we're talking about hospitals and clinics and labs and diagnostic centers and all the other type of medical institution that there's out there. The second is how much equipment these institutions have. So are they properly equipped? Do they have the equipment that's necessary for the population to go and get proper care? And these could be from X-ray machines all the way to linear accelerators, PET scanners, and so on. And the third pillar, which is critical, is do these institutions have the right amount of staff? And here we're talking about the nurses, the physicians, the technicians, the radiologists, and everyone else that's required to have a hospital system operate effectively. Okay, and what we see in Latin America is that we're quite well positioned in terms of the number of institutions that we have. However, when we compare ourselves to other OECD countries, we see that there's a big area of opportunity for both equipment and staffing. Okay, so these are areas of opportunity that we need to keep in mind, and we're going to delve into the equipment portion of that in just a second. And keep in mind that much of this information that we'll be sharing comes from the medical equipment market report that we've just released. So if we go to the next slide, please. Much of this information that we're presenting not only is found in the medical equipment market report, but it actually comes from some of the databases that we have in-house. And Abel mentioned that earlier. The data that we're seeing on this slide comes from our HospiScope database. Now, HospiScope gathers information from over 20,000 hospitals across Latin America, and we ask them every year to update their equipment counts, their bed counts, and all sorts of other information about the infrastructure of the institution. And here what we're looking at is the presence of key modalities, so key equipment within the hospital system. And what's fascinating is that when we do the sum and the tally on a regional basis, we see that there's a natural hierarchy to the presence of these modalities across hospital systems. Okay, and we see a natural breakdown into 6 key groups, from the extremely present categories of ECGs, EKGs, and X-ray machines, all the way to the more sophisticated and complex systems like linear accelerators, PETs, and obviously robotic surgery systems. Now, many stories can be told with this information, right, as we look at it. What's interesting from our standpoint is that we can break it down by country, by type of institution, so public and private, and so on and so forth, at our client's will. But it's interesting to consider that from a hospital perspective, this information can be used as a roadmap to understand what equipment or what modalities a hospital system could be adopting next, because it's very hard to leapfrog. It's very hard to go from you having EKGs and X-ray machines and all of a sudden getting to high complexity imaging systems like MRIs and CT scanners. So there's a natural path in evolution, a roadmap to technology adoption, and that's what's really useful for hospitals in this case. Now, for our clients in the manufacturing space and the equipment and medical space, what we see is that they're using a lot of this information in order to guide their sales force and to increase their targeting capabilities, to understand what their clients are really asking for and what they really need. And so they can really craft targeting strategies and marketing and sales strategies along those lines, which in turn is better also for the institutions as well as for the medical equipment manufacturers that we work with. Now, Chris, we've recently developed another use case for all this information about, key capital equipment and its presence within hospital systems across Latin America. And I understand that you actually have a success story to share with us today on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for bringing it up. So this model serves many purposes. One is, as you mentioned, as a technology adoption map, but it can also be used as a sales targeting and forecasting tool. So for instance, the use case you mentioned, maybe let me take a generic example to show everybody how this works. If a medical equipment manufacturer were to want to launch, say, a new piece of capital equipment, like a new version of an MRI machine, then through this map that we see here on the slide, we already know that we're talking about the top 25th percentile of hospitals, which would be most likely to acquire that piece of equipment, because we're talking about a tier 2 level hospital. That's just a generic, high-level perspective of the market. What we can do is develop things such as a propensity model. So looking at hospitals both in the public sector as well as in the private sector, and trying to detect which institutions are most likely to acquire that particular type of equipment based on which other hospitals already have it. And so there are ways to run statistical models to define which other institutions are most likely to acquire a similar piece of equipment. We can do that with quite a bit of sophistication, precisely because of the Hospiscope database that you mentioned earlier. So because every year we do this census of hospitals and to understand what new pieces of equipment they've acquired as part of their installed base, we have a very accurate read on the entire hospital landscape, both in the private and the public sector. And that's the basis upon which we run these models.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing that with us, Chris. Wonderful to see how all this data can be used for multiple uses by clients and companies out there. With that, we're going to now open up to our first poll question of the day, because we do want to hear from you both in the Q&A portion of this webinar as well as through some polls. So since 2008, which type of medical equipment has grown the most in Mexico's hospitals? So again, Chris, we use this data set, Hospiscope, to gather some of this data. And you can also find it in the medical equipment market report. So please, according to you, what do you think the medical equipment has grown the most since 2018 in Mexican hospitals? Ventilators, CT scanners, RIS, so radiology information systems, or robotic surgery systems? Excellent. We're going to now go and close our poll and see some of those results are. Terrific. Ventilators. You know, it's fascinating because I think everyone here would have thought ventilators as well, right? We all look back to the pandemic and see the ventilator crisis that we've experienced over the past 3 years, and see how many ventilators were sold in hospital systems across this time period. Interestingly enough, that is not the answer. According to our data sets, what we're seeing is that there's actually two medical equipment types that grew the most since 2018. The first is radiology information systems, and the second, robotic surgery systems in second place, tied at nearly between 12 and 14% each. The ventilator space was actually just below that at around 9 or 10%. And one of those reasons is because you might remember there was a ventilator shortage a couple of years ago. And while all the hospitals were scrambling to acquire them, there simply wasn't enough inventory to satisfy the demand. Chris, you're going to interject here, I think, with the question.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out the fact that the way this question is formulated is speaking about a 3-year trend, and that is one of the distinctions that we make in the medical equipment market report. So for the region as a whole, as well as for the countries we focus on, we share year-on-year growth data between 2021 and then moving into 2022, but we also show the 3-year trend. And so that gives the readers the opportunity to make more informed decisions and planning based on longer-term trends in the market.
That's a very good point, because what we've also seen, from our standpoint in the recent projects that we've conducted, is that when you're looking at comparable timelines, you simply cannot compare 2022 to 2020 or even 2021 for that matter. We really need to go back to 2019, so pre-pandemic in Latin America, right? In order to have a comparable standpoint. These 2 years have been really off the charts. So thank you all for participating in this poll. Chris, I'm now going to hand it over to you to just kind of recap what we've seen over the past couple of years and give us an outlook of what we can expect for 2023.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe let me start with that last comment you just shared, which is the importance of historical data, which is part of the medical equipment market report. In fact, 2019 turns out to be a critical year because it is the one for which the data that we have is probably the most representative of what the market will look like in 2022, because it was a snapshot of how things were right before the pandemic hit. And we'll be talking about some of the data in terms of procedure volumes and other key indicators that are showing us that we're getting back to those pre-pandemic levels. So I just wanted to make a plug for how important historical data is. The way we've structured the report for all our listeners and readers is as follows. We've been canvassing the market for several years now through the Hospiscope database, as well as other proprietary databases that we have. And we've extracted what we believe are the key insights. So the report has 4 different important sections. The first one is a general perspective that we provide on what are the key trends in the market over the course of this year, 2022, and looking ahead into 2023. And we're going to be showcasing some of that data in the next few slides. The second section presents some of the data around key equipment modalities, both in the aggregate at the regional level, as well as by country. We'll also be showing some of that data that we found particularly interesting in today's webinar. Just a note on the countries we showcase. Obviously, the bigger markets are featured prominently in the report, such as Brazil and Mexico. Also, Colombia, Argentina. Chile is not a particularly big market, but it's a very important one from an equipment sophistication standpoint, and we present totals for that country as well. And we also feature Peru, as well as a cluster of countries in Central America. So it really, although we don't cover absolutely every market in the region, we do believe that we cover the vast majority of the hospital base in Latin America through this focus on these 8 different markets. So with that, let's dig into this and show what we have here today. So the biggest headline that we've seen this year is that there has been a return of elective procedures. And as you can see on this graph, across the main markets in the region, the level of procedures has returned to pre-pandemic levels just a couple of months ago in the vast majority of cases. And so we expect that by the end of the year, it'll be higher than it was before the pandemic, and this growth trend will continue into 2023. Now, this has a number of implications, foremost amongst which is for planning purposes. So for anybody forecasting sales and marketing initiatives for the next year, this is an important data point to underpin your assumptions. So let's talk about what are the implications of this return to growth in the healthcare sector. If we can move to the next slide. As you can imagine, with the growth in procedures, both emergency procedures, which really didn't drop that much during the pandemic, but also the return to growth of elective procedures, obviously we can expect growth in different types of equipment as well as consumables. And in this regard, one of the data points that we've been tracking really closely throughout the year and throughout the pandemic is the behavior on the part of purchasing departments at hospitals for consumables. So all the types of products that are used in the OR. And clearly we're seeing a return to growth. This is just one snapshot that we saw earlier in the year in the first quarter. Bear in mind that we were still facing the Omicron variant of COVID, so things got off to a slow start in the first quarter, but have since picked up quite a bit more in the second quarter and moving into the third one. Now, I will say just a point that I think is salient for 2022. Some of the demand on the part of hospitals throughout the region was to replenish inventories that had been left depleted throughout the pandemic. So there, for certain types of equipment and especially for consumables, the growth may flatten somewhat in the coming year, but overall we're going to see a strong trend moving into 2023. So if we can move to the next slide, please. One area that probably will not surprise anybody is the growth of telemedicine throughout the pandemic, both by choice, but mainly because there was really no other option in many cases. Now, what's interesting is that indeed there was an uptake in telemedicine, both in the public sector as well as in private hospitals. But what's interesting to see is what has happened this year now that patients are going back to in-person treatments. Telemedicine is holding up, but not in every category. So what we're seeing is that telemedicine is still being used for certain types of routine visits. It's being used for screening, but it has limitations. Some of the limitations of telehealth include, on the one hand, it's not necessarily suitable for some types of diagnostics for some certain specialties like cardiology, for instance. It's hard to do an EKG over telemedicine. But at the same time, Another constraint for telemedicine in the region is infrastructure, technology infrastructure, internet bandwidth, the availability of internet in the patient's homes. So there's a topic of access that is still a constraint for greater uptake of telemedicine throughout the region. And a third consideration has to do with the level of sophistication in telehealth. So if we're talking about routine visits or regular follow-ups for patients who's completed their surgery or their treatment, that's one scenario. But if we're talking about telehealth that's more advanced, where the physician needs to be able to consult diagnostics and imaging, then you need more robust IT infrastructure. And so that's why we chose to feature the data points around the picture archiving communication system, otherwise known as PACS, as well as the radiology information system data, or RIS, because those are critical for more advanced uses of telehealth, including the exchange of images. Now, as you can see here, there is strong growth in these categories, but it is important to mention that we're talking about growth from a low base and a low penetration level. The one exception in the region, which we feel is important to showcase, is Chile. So I mentioned earlier how, although that market is small by volume, it is extremely interesting in terms of its level of technology sophistication. So for any of our listeners or readers of the medical equipment market report who focus on higher tech and capital intensive medical equipment, Chile is definitely a market to focus on. And you know, I mentioned Chile, but I know that you, Guillaume, had participated recently in a series of conferences and a panel on telehealth. So in addition to just this focus that I mentioned, what other highlights do you think would be important to put forth to our audience today in regard to telemedicine?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. So, you know, on the one hand, as you stated earlier, we had a contraction with COVID, a contraction of procedure volumes that ranged anywhere between 40 and 70%, depending on the complexity and the urgency of that procedure. And I think we all recall times when hospitals were actually closed and public couldn't go to a hospital to get taken care of. It's actually reassuring to hear that right now, the procedure volumes are back on track. Not only are they growing, but they're now at pre-pandemic levels. So what did patients do during that 2-year gap, right? Like what happened? So recently we hosted a webinar with Florida International University, and I invite everyone here to listen in on that webinar. It's actually a very fascinating and interesting webinar on telehealth and the growth of that in the region. One of the panelists we had on from a very prominent hospital in Latin America mentioned that pre-pandemic, you know, they had the vision of telehealth already and increasing access to health and health systems for the population that's very diverse and very spread out across Latin American countries. And so this hospital system already invested ahead of time on backbone infrastructure, on communication systems, on integration platforms, essentially all sorts of back-end IT, which would facilitate telehealth moving forward. Lo and behold, the pandemic happens and patients can't come in anymore. They went from attending 4,000 patients a year through their telehealth system to attending 4,000 patients a day. Okay, that's how quickly their platform grew. And they were able to do that because the IT infrastructure was already in place. It was extremely scalable, highly scalable. Now, granted, now that we're exiting the pandemic, you know, pandemic seems to have passed, they're back to about maybe 10,000 consultations a year. So a little bit more than double the pre-pandemic levels, but certainly well below what they were at the peak of the pandemic. But the legacy that this leaves behind will be with them for years because the infrastructure is in place, which means that at any point in time, should there be issues of social unrest, of war, God forbid, or of another pandemic, hopefully not, they already have the systems in place to be able to care for patients no matter where they are. And right now, I think that the challenge that institutions are facing is how to drive telehealth as a sustainable form moving forward, and how to capitalize on that financially in terms of capitalizing the patients, their consults, et cetera. I think the verdict is still out on how to turn infrastructure into a solid business case.
Indeed, and some of the areas where we expect to see more deployment of telehealth is actually in the public sector, precisely because of the leverageability and the ability to scale across multiple hospitals. So that's a trend to look out for in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, Chris. Thanks for bringing it up. When we have a country like Mexico, where you have the IMSS system in place, ISSSTE, Semarnat, and these hospitals, not only are they much bigger than their private sector counterparts, right? Like the average public sector hospital in Mexico is about 100 beds. Public sector is about 15. Yeah, you heard that right. 15 beds in the private sector in Mexico. Very small hospitals in the private sector in Mexico. Obviously, in parallel to world-class hospitals that are very large on the private sector, but these IMSS systems have hundreds of hospitals under their umbrella, each with an average of about 100 beds. So you can just imagine the leverageability and the impact that has on health systems. So anyway, this is some of the information that you'll find in the medical equipment market report for 2022, and that we just chose to dive into here today because it's extremely relevant to the current situation that we're getting into. Back to you, Chris.
Well, speaking of the report, we'd like to showcase some of the data that we feature within it. So let's take a look at a first series of data points, which are the systems that grew the most by country. So you'll recall that earlier I mentioned the main markets that we feature in the report. They're listed here in alphabetical order. And for each one, we have highlighted the particular equipment system that has seen the most year-on-year growth. Now, you'll notice that there's a recurring theme here of the radiology information system, as well as mammography systems, for instance, in Argentina and Colombia. Some of the growth here has to do with the fact that in these markets, these systems had a low penetration level. And so, of course, any amount of investment shows up as a larger growth trend. Nevertheless, what is interesting is the big takeaway is hospitals are investing again. And one important aspect about investing in these types of capital equipment in Latin America is that there's obviously a focus on quality, but it's also important for medical equipment manufacturers to consider the cost aspect. So any kind of system that is cost efficient will have greater probabilities of being successful in these markets. Now, just as we talked about, greater growth categories per country, we'd also like to show on the next slide a different approach, which is looking at very specialized equipment. What are the trends here? So we, as I mentioned, every year we do a census of all the hospitals to understand which pieces of equipment, which modalities have they invested in. So we have a pretty comprehensive picture of the installed base of different types of equipment. Here we've chosen to focus on 8 different types of specialized equipment. Here we're looking at the regional totals, but know that in the medical equipment market report, we have more data broken out by country. So for any of our audience members that are targeting specific markets within the region, the report will help you understand what is the market size for each of these specialized equipment modalities. You'll see that there is a significant amount of growth. Again, we're talking about specialized equipment. So this is the tier 1 and tier 2 hospitals. We're talking about roughly 25%, so a quarter of the hospital base within the region are the ones that are looking to acquire these types of equipment modalities. Some are in the public sector, but also this is an area where certain larger private hospitals tend to make significant investments. And I'll just mention that these types of targeting exercises are the projects that we run when we do market intelligence for our clients. So we're able to give much more detailed answers when we look at these markets more closely. In the report, we have the overall totals for the region and by country, as I mentioned. So I would encourage you all to take a look at it. Now, just as we looked at specialized equipment, let's look on the next slide. What can we expect in terms of some of the more basic equipment totals? Now, here you'll see that the growth levels by equipment type are somewhat less aggressive than on the previous slide. However, we're talking about a much higher penetration level. So if just take an example of the patient monitors, there are over 100,000 units already installed across hospitals in the region. What are the implications here? One point that is important to highlight is this is the vast majority of the market. We're talking about tier 5, tier 6 hospitals. This is the lion's share of the hospital infrastructure in Latin America. So this is where the volume is. Again, we just mentioned this so that you can be more accurate in your targeting and forecasting strategies for 2023. A point that I think is worth mentioning here is that as you can see, ventilators grew a lot. That's not a big surprise. However, we do expect this growth level to taper off into 2023 as hospitals begin to shift their spending away from treatments focused on COVID to different types of equipment investments as elective procedures come back online. And with that, I think it's a good time to shift gears, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Abel. So before we ask the poll question, I'll just say this question that we're going to ask is based on the information that we feature in the medical equipment market report about technology leaders in the region. Over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. That's correct. We do have a section on that. So before we lead into talking about that section, we did want to get your opinion on this. I'm going to launch the poll now so we can get your opinion. That the slide there is sort of a placeholder for the video, but the actual poll now is being launched. So you should see it on your screen, and then you should be able to respond. We offer a number of different hospitals here as options. So which one is leading Latin America in terms of the amount of robotic surgery systems? As we can see, we have a couple of prestigious hospitals here. We have Hospital Italiano from Buenos Aires. We have Albert Einstein in Brazil, Médica Sur in Mexico, Fundación de Santa Fe in Bogota, and of course, none of the above if you think that none of these are actual candidates in this sense. So that's an area that's grown quite a bit. There's quite a bit of investment, of course, too, for robotic surgery for any kind of hospital. So it's interesting to see which ones are leading it. And as Chris mentioned, that is indeed part of what we do in the report as we list technology leaders. And I'll explain a little bit about that on the next slide after we go through the results. Looks like just about everybody has had their say. So let's close out the poll now and let's see, first of all, what you guys had to say. So you guys, the large majority of you voted for Albert Einstein with 69%, and we have Médica Sur at 15%, Fundación at 8%, and none of the above at 8%. And interestingly, Hospital Italiano got 0 response in terms of that sense. So that's kind of interesting. So let's see what the results actually show based on what we have in the report with the data that we get personally from the hospitals directly. Okay, let's take a look here. So what the results tell us is Hospital Italiano and Albert Einstein are tied. So it's kind of a trick question. They're both tied with 3 robotic surgery systems each. And so that's one of those things that was kind of unexpected there. And that's the whole reason behind we do what we do, so we can get at some of these strategic answers and understand sort of what's going on here. This is featured robotic surgery systems as part of an overall section on hospital technology leaders. Now here what you're seeing are the #1 technology leaders for the different countries that are covered in the report itself. So we have Argentina, Brazil, Central America, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico in this sense. Obviously, Central America aggregates all the 6 Spanish-speaking countries there. For Brazil, as you can see, there's a difference in terms of the categories, and that has to do with idiosyncrasies when it comes to gathering data for Brazil itself. So we can't get the same level of detail as we can in this type of category, in this sense. But as you can see, what we show are a lot of high ticket type of expensive equipment, and we show the hospitals sort of lead each one. So these are the number ones, but in the actual report itself, we list the top 10 for each country. So basically at that point, if you look at the fact that we have sort of 5 countries and 1 region covered, that's a total of 6. There's a lot of hospitals that are being covered to break down this kind of information and very specific information about this high-tech equipment. Why is this helpful? This helps you understand some of the clients that could be very good for some of these high ticket items that we sell in terms of product launches in the future and things of that nature. And of course, it's not just these that we're listing here, but it's a lot. And so there's a lot of potential there in Latin America, more so than you would expect for a lot of these specialized expensive equipment items. So with that sort of established, and this is sort of a part there of the report, as we said, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you to sort of wrap things up.
Great, excellent, thank you. So just before we head into the Q&A section of this webinar, I do want to remind everyone that you have the Q&A button on your screen that you can just fill out any question. This is a live webinar. We've been exchanging with Ruben a few times here already, asking some questions. Please feel free to post your question there, and we're going to do our best to get to it. Now, a quick reminder, we don't have all the answers to all the questions, but we will do our best to give you some insights and points of view. In the meantime, everything that you saw here today is just a very small portion of what you can find in the Medical Equipment Market Report of 2022. I do invite you to inquire more about it. You'll have our contact information on the last slide of this deck. And you're going to see that the Medical Equipment Market Report for 2022 is packed with information, some of which is presented here: infographics, country breakdowns, trends, data from multiple data sets, obviously HospiScope, but also Surgiscope, our procedure volume data set, and many others. So I invite you to contact us about that, get a 30% discount just for attending here today. It's a $7,500 value, you get 30% off, and we can certainly talk more about it. Now, after the fun part of this webinar, our Q&A. Here's our contact information, by the way. I'm sorry, Buck, go back. So we can continue the conversation after today's webinar. Please feel free to reach out. Christoph, myself, and the rest of the team have one passion in common, which is exchanging, dialoguing, and commenting with our clients. So please feel free to reach out. This is what we love to do. In the meantime, now let's go to our Q&A section. Abel, do you have any questions that came in while we've been presenting here today?
Yes, we have one here that's from Andres, and he's asking, how do you think LATAM investment differs in focus of modalities versus the rest of the world? I don't know if we have a comparison contrast for that or not.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, and I see more questions coming in, so please feel free to keep them coming in as we're discussing some points. We've got about 15 minutes just ahead of us here today to answer these questions. So what I find is interesting about Latin America is the waves of investment in terms of capital equipment. You're going to see that robotic surgery systems, for instance, Andres, and I'm not sure what type of equipment you're specifically referring to, but let's just talk about robotic surgery systems for a second. There's less than 200 installed in Latin America, and probably the potential for several hundred more, right? So hospitals that have the correct infrastructure and capabilities to acquire equipment, but just don't have it. And there's two things that are at play here. One is the type of offering that's currently there. So we know who the big brands are and what they're doing, but it's also the ability for the hospitals to actually acquire these type of systems. And it's not only a question of finance. It's also a question of the use that they'll be able to give to these systems. So do they have the proper patient flow? Do they have the technology savviness in-house to be able to actually incorporate these equipment into their processes? And as we saw, there's a lot of institutions across the region, but few of them have the number of beds. And I keep going back to the number of beds issue because it's a proxy for the size of the institution, and also a proxy for the number of cases they'll be able to see in order to to get the equipment. And that's something that we often hear from our clients, whether it's from an X-ray machine standpoint or for a tomography standpoint. Is there enough patient flow and patient demand for it, right? That's one point. Can the hospital actually acquire it? Do they have the financial ability to do that? Do they have access to the capital markets in order to get the loans that they need for that to happen? So we know that it's a very dynamic market. More and more, there are companies that are offering leasing options, either in-house or through third parties. If I'm going to put a general feeler out there, I would say that Latin America is probably looking for that tech tier 2 and 3 adoption. So if we could go back to that slide about, I think it's around slide 14, where we're talking about the tech tier adoption model. Okay. Yeah, right here. So definitely a big need for, tech tier 3, 4, and possibly even 5, right? So big need for that middle market segment of equipment. So we see a lot of general institutions that have, the newborn cribs, the ventilators, the infusion pumps, etc. Then a group of institutions around 3, 4, 5 that really need to pump it up a bit. So I'd say that's where probably the biggest opportunity is in terms of need right now. And then obviously, tech tier 1 and 2 for the much more sophisticated systems.
And Guillaume, just to add one consideration to the 2 criteria that you mentioned, another one is the presence of properly trained staff to use the equipment. And for a number of equipment modalities, we've been hearing that that is one of the bottlenecks within the various markets in Latin America, and could be a point of difference, going back to the question, between Latin America and some of the other regions in the world.
Totally. And let's keep in mind that China, by in and of itself, has over 20,000 hospitals, right? In and of itself. So as many hospitals in China as there are in all of Latin America. When we do this segmentation here, Andres, one of the ways that we can also do it is by looking at the level of care of the institution. So 1, 2, or 3, general hospital, primary care, general, and specialized hospital, to really see that breakdown. And if you'd like to take that conversation offline and go in depth a little bit more, by all means, you have our contact information. We'd love to hear from you. Okay. Cool. Andres, I'm sorry, Abel, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, let's just advance back to where we were before. As far as another question here, we have a very straightforward one. So which market offers the best sales potential for 2023?
I'm sorry, can you repeat, please?
Yes, which market offers the best sales potential for 2023?
Okay. Chris, you want to take the lead on that one?
Yeah, the easy way out is it depends, of course. we will suggest some guidelines in terms of size of the market. Obviously, Brazil stands out just based on the sheer number of hospitals and hospital beds in relation to the rest of the market. Mexico also a significant market, the second in the region. So if you're looking to make projections for certain basic types of equipment, those 2 markets are going to remain attractive just based on volume. However, some of the data points that we feature in the Medical Equipment Market Report 2022 reveal that for certain types of specialized equipments, there are 2 markets that stand out compared to their peers in the region. One of them is Colombia, and the other is Chile. So we talked about Chile earlier during today's call, but we have not yet mentioned Colombia. What's interesting about Colombia is that there is significant growth across multiple equipment modalities in a specialized category. So that is definitely a market worth watching more closely.
Totally.
All right.
Chris, I'm just going to add to that before moving on, Abel. Chile's a fascinating market, right? Just to put things in perspective for the audience who might not be aware, in Brazil, we're talking about over 6,000 hospitals, Mexico over 3,000, Chile about 400, all right? So a fraction of these 2 larger markets. Yet in terms of penetration rates, Chile has some of the highest penetration rates of sophisticated equipment, going from tomography scanners, MRIs, robotic surgery systems, telehealth systems, PACS and RIS, amongst others. And one of the reasons for that is, again, going back to the size of the average hospital in Chile. We saw that in an earlier slide, about 100 beds per hospital in Chile, compared to an average of around 70 in the case of Brazil, and if I'm not mistaken, around 40 in the case of Mexico, which again is very opposite ends of the scale between public and private sector. In Mexico, about 100 beds in the public and about 15 in the private. So completely different dynamics in that regard. And Chile becomes a fascinating market from that standpoint, because it's easy to get products in, it's easy to test them, it's easy to sell them and implement them. And the hospitals are just large and willing to invest in more costly equipment.
All right, thanks so much, Guillermo. We have another question here. This is from Rubens, and the question is, how do you see the role of pharmacies becoming more important in the telehealth area?
So across the region, pharmacies, I feel, have been playing a supplemental role to healthcare systems, where you'll see, in Mexico, just using that as an example, a pharmacy and then a little consultorio right on the outside, where you can pay 30 pesos or 40 pesos, whatever the cost is these days. So that's equivalent of $2, $3 to go in and see a general physician who's going to write your prescription to get a product that you're going to use in the pharmacy. Now, while this was initially used as a tactic on behalf of the large chain pharmacies, primarily in order to sell more controlled pharmaceutical drugs that needed prescriptions, the pharmacies have also gotten to see that they have a captive audience here, that they have hundreds of thousands of patients that come in and use their services, but on which they're not capitalizing on all the information and their sales ability. And so what several pharmacies have been doing is creating their own CRM. Like, imagine an EMR system, but for walk-in patients, right? That only they are seeing. This has a huge benefit in terms of increasing access to healthcare for the layman who doesn't have much money and does not want, and reduces friction in that ecosystem, because it's a very low barrier to pay, like 30, 40 pesos, to get what you need, and you get it done right now, very quickly, very efficiently. Rather than going through a public system or public hospital system, it's going to take you half a day, it's going to take forever, etc. The drawback from that, however, is that you're alienating people from your public centralized system, where you actually can keep track of the EMR, the electronic health records, and have their patient journeys, and you're pushing that onto a private system, right, which is much more fragmented. So there's definitely a drawback to that. Some pharmacies have gone as far as implementing telehealth and teleconsults. Some of them have also gone as far as also selling private insurance models. So the pharmacy space is very dynamic and has changed dramatically over the past, I'd say, 5 to 10 years.
And I imagine, Guillaume, just to add a little bit to this perspective, that we have to properly segment the pharmacy space. It's not the same to have low cost, generic white label selling pharmacies compared to some of the others. I mean, you mentioned Mexico as an example, but there are a number of privately owned chains that are nationwide and have a regional footprint that target more affluent customers. So I could imagine that telehealth might be, or the insurance products you mentioned might be in those parts of the pharmacy market, but not in all of it uniformly.
Absolutely. And something else that's fascinating is that there's even been, groups like FEMSA, so Coca-Cola FEMSA, the bottler distributor in Mexico, who's actually gone and acquired pharmacy chains outside of Mexico. So creating almost like a regional platform from a pharmacy standpoint. I mean, this is just started happening about 4 or 5 years ago, but it's breaking all the traditional rules and barriers that we've seen in traditional healthcare models for years.
All right.
So Rubens, please don't make this your last question, Rubens. Keep them coming. We've got 5 minutes left here.
Okay. We have another one here. This one is from Domingo, and he's asking, do you have any idea why the average bed per hospital is so different between Mexico and Chile?
Absolutely. Thank you, Domingo, for asking that question. Very good point. So again, if we look at the average, it's pretty consistent. Where we see that, disparate number is between the average size of a private hospital in Mexico and one in Chile, for instance. And one of the reasons is because we've seen a lot of growth of specialized centers that, have, let's say, a treatment center that will take care of one or two issues at most, and they'll have two operating rooms or one operating room, and we'll have call-in physicians that just walk in and take care of that. So I'll give you an example of that. An orthopedic surgeon who I personally went to visit several years ago in Mexico, he had standing relationships with large hospital institutions, and he also had one with a very small clinic where they would provide the tools that he needed on demand. So they had the operating room, they had the assistant surgeon, they had the nurses, and they had the anesthesiology staff, but only on demand. And so the costs were much lower to do that than to go through the much larger and more sophisticated hospital. But it was for a very specific need. And so there's many institutions like that have developed in Mexico over the past 10, 15 years. We are seeing to a certain degree some consolidation in that space. Groups like Star Medica coming in and acquiring other hospitals, or Grupo Ángeles doing the same thing. But that helps explain some of the dynamics in that regard. It also happens that this is at the same time as we're seeing insurance plans growing in Mexico specifically, and insurance plans offering insurance for a slightly lower tier than the typical elite 10 to 15% of the population. And so kind of like a middle tier plan that's less costly, but also doesn't get you access to the tier 1 hospitals. It gets you something a little bit lower, a little bit more economical. And it tends to be much smaller institutions that are more specialized and that can drive efficiencies of scale through their systems. And a good example of that is the Cancer Center Tech Salud 100 in Querétaro, for instance. They're able to drive efficiencies because they're so specialized and therefore offer lower costs. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or complement to it.
I would just say, I think the original question was to comparing Mexico to Chile. So in the case of Chile, I'll just point out that contrary to Mexico, the hospitals that are large and have a large number of beds are both in the public and the private sector. And so that accounts for some of the dynamics of the Chilean market.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for complimenting that. And Guillermo, I see you have another question regarding ophthalmology equipment. I think we'll have to leave that one for a parallel conversation. If you'd like to reach out to us, here's our contact information. It's on screen right now. Be happy to engage with you on that front, Guillermo. Thank you for your questions. Abel, do we have any other question here, or is it time to wrap up?
We have a couple of minutes. One final question that seems kind of germane is from Jaime, and he asks, how do I get this report?
That's terrific. Hi, Jaime. So if we could just backtrack one slide then, please, Abel. You'll see that this report is for sale. $7,500. You get 30% off for being a participant. And there's the web link right there where you can find out more about it, get the table of contents, a couple of graphs. We'll also be sharing today's presentation with everyone as well as the live recording. And on the next slide, please, Abel, Jaime, here you'll have our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to myself, to Christoph, if you have any questions about the report. We'd be happy to discuss them in greater detail, make sure it fits your needs. Or maybe if there's something specific that you need answered and that doesn't entail a full report, it's something that maybe we could do as a consulting basis. So you can just see all of the depth of information and access to information that we have, and we'd be happy to put that at your service.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Guillaume, because obviously one report, even a 72-page report like this one is highly detailed, can't answer everything. So a lot of times, even in the webinars we're seeing now, we're getting highly specific questions, and some of those things just can't be answered through the standard data channels that even we have as a company in our databases, but actually require a customized study. And that's something that GHI does all the time. And that's something that companies can use to answer very specific strategic questions that are specific to them and what their needs are. So obviously reach out to either Christophe or to Guillaume as far as that's concerned, and you'll be able to find out more about what we can do for you in that area as well, beyond just the report.
Terrific. Thank you. So in respect of everybody's time, I want to extend my deepest gratitudes and thanks for participating in today's webinar. I hope it's been enlightening, that you've been able to walk away with something. Obviously, you'll be getting, again, this presentation deck as well as the live recording. Thank you again for making the time. Please, let's stay in touch. Let's continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for participating.